The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, who can Canada trade with besides the U.S.? Then Steve Paikin brings you the story of baseball's hidden Ontario origins. That's ahead on The Agenda. Where to now? That is the question Canadian businesses and trade representatives have been asking themselves since the United States began threatening to add tariffs to Canadian imports. If the U.S. has become an unreliable trade partner, where in the world does Canada seek new trade deals? Is it even possible to replace the U.S. as a trade partner? Let's ask. In the nation's capital, Meredith Lilly, professor and Simon Reisman Chair in International Economic Policy at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. And here in our Toronto studio, Julie Wynne, Chair of the Canada-ASEAN at the York Centre for Asian Research at York University. ASEAN stands for the Association of Southeast Asia Nations. And Mark Warner, a trade, investment, and competition lawyer at Maw Law in Toronto. Welcome to you both in studio, and Meredith for joining us on the line. All right, before we start, I want to show a chart that illustrates Canada's significant trade relation with the U.S. This is the share of Canada's merchandise exports by region in 2023. Now, you can see in this donut graph, a large swath of it, 77.1% in red, that's the United States. Latin America and Caribbean in teal at 2.9%, the Indo-Pacific 10.8 in purple, and in pink, Europe and Central Asia, and then in blue, a little tiny little sliver there, the Middle East and Africa at 1.6%. Meredith, I'm going to come to you first. Different Canadian governments have talked about diversifying our trade partners for years, but there never seems to be much progress. What are the reasons Canada leans so heavily on the U.S. when it comes to our exports?
Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. So I think the reason that Canadian firms rely so heavily, despite the fact that, as you say, different governments have sought to open up market access through things like free trade agreements and trade missions and those kinds of things, the reason firms continue to trade with the United States is actually because it makes a lot of sense to do so. The U.S. is the world's largest market. It's right next door to Canada. It has very similar regulatory practices and a similar business environment to Canada. So for our firms, it's actually quite easy and profitable for them to trade with the United States. There's something called the gravity model in economics that predicts that all of these factors mean the U.S. can and should be Canada's primary trade destination. And so firms are going to only look to other markets if there's a business case to do so. And what they're going to be looking for is things like a stable business environment, opportunities to make profit. But firms are not charities. They're not looking to move to new markets to promote Canadian values or foreign policy. Those might be nice side benefits, but that's not what they're in it for. They're in it primarily to make money. And the other thing I think you should be aware of is that for the most part, Canada's large firms are operating in multiple markets. They trade with the United States, but roughly half of them also trade with an additional market beyond the United States. And so when we're now looking to encourage other firms in Canada to explore new markets, we're mostly looking at small and medium business. And they have many reasons that you can imagine that it might be kind of daunting to explore new markets. So, maybe we can get into it. I think the tariff situation might change that, but there are good reasons that Canadian firms historically have mostly traded with the United States.
Very quickly on that, when you talk about that stability, the small and medium businesses, Meredith, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business just came out with a report that said 47% of small businesses don't consider the U.S. a reliable trade partner. Is the U.S. a reliable trade partner, looking at it right now where we stand?
right now today, I don't think it's giving the signals that it is. And actually, signals matter a lot. The signals of how reliable a market is can be as important as the reality of it. And so at the moment, the signals being sent from the United States is that it is not a reliable trade partner. And so small firms, for instance, if a shipment was caught up at the border and that was caught up for a very long period of time, a large firm might be able to weather that and would have resources in place to help them kind of unstick the problems associated with that shipment being caught at the border. But a small business can't necessarily take on that liability. And so they have different considerations when they think about whether or not the U.S. is reliable and whether they have the resources to help them weather those kinds of challenges.
All right, Mark, I feel like I'm going to need a little history lesson here. But is the trend of the U.S. becoming more insular when it comes to international trade new or not?
I don't think it's really all that new. I think that if when you look back at these things, as I spend my day doing this for the last 40 plus years, I think probably the United States started to move inward probably in the Clinton administration. It's a bit confusing for us in Canada, I guess, because it started right around the time that NAFTA the old free trade agreement was converted to NAFTA. And the Clinton got elected really campaigning against NAFTA and then let it go through by adding a labor and environmental hook to it. And then the work that had already been in progress towards a WTO agreement, that sort of was already on its way. But by that time, you can sort of see Ross Perot, running a famously anti-trade third-party candidacy that meant that Clinton didn't win a majority of the popular vote. And then you take it to the Bush administration, and they're acting unilaterally. And then I think that even after the WTO came into existence, early decisions of the WTO, especially after China joined, meant that the Americans pretty immediately were saying, that's not what we negotiated for. And every presidency since then has sort of seen a little bit moving backwards. I think what Trump changes is from the rhetoric to sort of real threats. I think the world had probably got used to, and especially us in Canada, just tuning it out. 2% of NATO requirements. What did he say? I didn't hear that. Right. What do you want me to do with, digital services tax? Sorry, Mr. Biden, I didn't hear you. And Trump comes along, and it's the ultimate expression. Well, I'm going to say it in a way and do it in a way that you're going to listen to me. And he's not just doing that to Canada, but to the rest of the world. As the old post-World War II model was a model where the United States was the economic superpower and the military superpower, and it engaged in what maybe the rest of the world wouldn't like to admit, but asymmetric trade liberalization. It opened its large consumer market and said to the rest of the world, come and sell to us, which we'd been doing for hundreds of years here in Canada, and the rest of the world joined. Now, as they have more competitors, first in the 70s and the 80s with Japan and Germany, and then with the rising China in the 90s, the Americans are saying, we want to redo the terms of that bargain. And I think the world has been struggling ever since to figure out how to do that.
Okay. All right, Julie, we're going to move away from the U.S. because I want to talk about some sort of exciting news. Canada is close to concluding a free trade agreement with the ASEAN trade bloc, which is made up of 10 countries in the Indo-Pacific region. Why would that be a significant deal for Canada?
Well, I think I will discuss the business case to do business with ASEAN. So ASEAN is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Last year was about 4.5%, and the next year could be over 5%. And countries like the Philippines and Vietnam could be between 6 to over 7%.
Okay, fast growing.
And ASEAN as a bloc is the fourth largest trading partner for Canada, about $40 billion. And also ASEAN has about 700 million people. So after China and India and China, so ASEAN is the third largest.
Lots of potential there.
Yeah, lots of potential, and the workforce is young and educated. So when we look at the Canada-ASEAN free trade agreement, which we hope can conclude this year, we also have to look at the existing agreement with ASEAN, and that would be the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So from this partnership, we have access to 4 ASEAN countries. So we can use what we have right now to access these ASEAN markets. In addition to that, for the CPTPP, we also have access to Japan, also to Mexico, and now to the UK, as the UK has just joined this agreement.
All right, I want to move around the map a little bit. Meredith, relations with India broke down over the government's allegations that Indian government agents are tied to the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada. I'm curious, what is the prospect of a renewed trade talks with India under a new Canadian government of any stripe?
I think that a changing government could open opportunities for trade negotiations, but negotiations with India have traditionally been difficult. Negotiating agreement is hard for a number of reasons. India is quite protectionist, particularly around agriculture. Another major area of interest for India is what we call temporary entry. And so that is not technically temporary foreign workers, but it brings forward similar issues that temporary foreign workers bring. And so there are other reasons domestically in Canada that I think we would find it difficult to advance negotiations in a significant way. But whenever there is a change in government, if a previous government has had difficult relations with a country, then any change in government can be helpful to move negotiations forward or kind of start with a new lens. So I think there is some possibility that discussions could advance. But at the same time, I think Canada needs to think about what it would be seeking from India in trade negotiations and whether we're likely to achieve those objectives.
Mark, I'll get you to pick up on that.
Yeah, I think I agree with Meredith. I think that a new government does provide an opportunity to restart, to reset. I think the issue that India has with almost all of its trading partners is it's really hard to advance, whether it's negotiating with China or the European Union or the United Kingdom or the United States even. And they have a fairly discrete set of asks. I mean, they have largely involves the movement of people.
Right.
And at the scale at which most of their trading partners say, no. And that's usually where it hangs it all up. I mean, now, so I'm not sure how, given the current environment, a new Canadian government would stick handle that. But, and obviously the other thing is, while India is a large country with lots of people, I mean, it's really looking to sell things to us. I mean, what the hard part for Canada is trying to identify a new market that's out there wanting to buy what we make, advanced manufacturers. Now, we don't want to be, and some of us don't want to be the hewers of wood and the drawers of water that we were traditionally to the United States. But unfortunately, most of the other countries in the world we would trade with would like us to be that role to them. They're not really looking to buy high-priced electronic goods from Canada unless they can't get it anywhere else.
Meredith, do you want to hop in there?
I just wanted to pick up on the Hewers of Wood piece because I've actually written an article called Hewers of Wood, Drawers of Water 2.0 that makes the case for what foreign countries want from Canada. So I think Mark is completely right that foreign markets largely want energy, minerals, natural resources, and agriculture. And it's not realistic that we're going to start exporting vehicles outside of North America, for instance. And so we need to be really serious about Canada's comparative advantages and what other countries want from us if we're serious about trade diversification. And so that means things like getting energy to tidewater, approving new mines and making them operational. And those are the things that other countries are seeking to buy from Canada. So I think we need to be really clear-headed about that.
I would just add one thing to that, to pick up what Julie said earlier about ASEAN. It seems to me, I remember the first time that I was in Cambodia, and I was walking around and downtown in the capital city, and there I saw Manulife signs everywhere.
Right. Yeah.
Because what the other thing we do provide are services. It may well be that the goods, we won't compete with advanced manufacturing, but some of our financial services sectors and other service sectors do have an opportunity in those newer markets as well.
Okay. Before I come to Julie, I do want to talk about China very quickly with you, Mark. Last week, China's ambassador said the country is open to negotiating a free trade agreement with Canada, but earlier in the month, we know that China tariffed Canadian canola by 100%, pork by 25%. What are the main obstacles preventing a free trade deal with China?
I mean, I think the obstacles are Canada has had a strategy since the 1970s, maybe a little bit later, of sort of riding two horses, right? We were going to sort of open to China, have our services industry go largely to China, and as well as we would sort of build on our historic relationship with the United States. As American-China trade tensions intensify, it's harder and harder to sort of ring fence what we do with China. And so there are going to be increasing demands on Canada to basically match whatever the Americans are doing. Like we did, that got China upset most recently, was to put the 100% tariffs on electric vehicles. And not only did we do that, but we did it using a blunt instrument called Section 53 of the customs tariff, which is a replica of Section 301 that the Americans use under their laws. We didn't go through the sort of WTO fiction like the Europeans did, of bringing an anti-dumping suit or whatever other thing we could have had a fig leaf to. So that's an obstacle, and it'll be an increasing obstacle for Canada going forward. We have to decide. We had this free trade agreement with the United States. The next step up, they teach you in school from a free trade agreement, is a customs union. And I guess the question Canada is going to have to decide is, are we at a point now where we have to harmonize more explicitly with our trading relationships with third parties with the United States? And if we do that, it'll be very hard to have a separate agreement with China.
All right. Julie, I want to come to you. Let's get your takes on sort of the main obstacles from preventing the trade deal with China. I do want to mention that we have learned that Mark Carney has rejected sort of boosting ties with China. He wants to go in favor with European Union at the moment. Let's get your thoughts on that, but also sort of the obstacles that are preventing China and Canada from working together, free trade.
Right. So I could talk about this in the context of China-ASEAN relations and also Canada-ASEAN relations. Well, ASEAN countries try to avoid being too economically reliant on China. And that's why they try to diversify their trade, their relationships. And at the same time, Canada also wants to diversify. So I think this is a great opportunity for China, for Canada and ASEAN work together. And speaking of ASEAN needs and priorities, I think we need to really understand ASEAN and them and the members, that ASEAN try to balance the geopolitical tensions between China and the U.S.
Right.
So we have to see that that's a kind of the difficult situation for ASEAN countries. And when we understand their situation, their needs and priorities, we could have a better plan for doing business with ASEAN and also with China.
All right, I want to stick with you, Julie, because I'm curious, when we talk about business, Meredith had mentioned, we're talking about profits. We're talking, about what deals work for either country. But I am curious, should Canada take the values of another nation into account when it comes to deciding whether or not to trade with a country? Why? Why not?
Right. So here we could discuss values versus interests. We could talk about economic gravity. So definitely. Values are important, and Canadians are proud of our values. But at the same time, to build relationships, especially in this context that we seek new or improve existing alliances, then we have to see our partners' needs and priorities, so that we can build the trust. So I think here trust is very important, and I think that ASEAN has a lot of trust in Canada as a peaceful country that would like to work with ASEAN. So in the future, when we do that, when we balance between values and interests, we will advance our interests, at the same time protect our values as well.
All right, Meredith, same question. Values versus interests.
Obviously, I think values are important. At the same time, many of the countries I think that represent high growth are not countries that we necessarily have a shared set of values with. So while it sounds nice to increase our trade with Europe, and I worked for Stephen Harper when he signed the Canada-Europe trade agreement, so I obviously believe in increasing our trade relations with Europe. It's been a pretty slow and difficult game so far, frankly, and the Europeans seem to be doing a better job at exporting to Canada than Canadian firms are doing exporting to Europe, if I'm completely honest. So it's great to say that we want to trade more with Europe and we have shared values, so that's easy, but it's not going particularly well. So as I think about other countries that are high growth and that represent good opportunities, high consumption countries that represent good opportunities for growth and exports for Canada, sometimes those countries are not always completely aligned with our values. And I think it's an important question for Canadians to think about, because as the easy places to trade are sort of checked off our list, we're left with a different list. And, countries like Australia have found ways to trade with their neighbors who do not always share their values in a way that so far Canadians, I think we just haven't been faced with those difficult choices.
All right. Mark, I want to introduce another list of countries. It was a small sliver represented on our donut graph there. There are 1.5 billion people in Africa, and the GDP growth in many countries there are outpacing the growth in the West. Why doesn't Canada trade more with African nations?
Well, we have a bigger investment relationship with China through the extractive sector, through our mining companies and these companies that are headquartered in Canada. So there's that part of it. I think part of it, too, is the diaspora basis. I mean, for the way Canada has pursued sort of advancing trade around the world has been sort of built through the diaspora, it seems to me. And various governments, I think, have found that easier to do with in Asia and in Southeast Asia and in South Asia than in Africa. That probably in part has to do with historic relations and the more recent nature of the immigrant population. But I think it's a good question. I mean, also I think that's a place where Canada does tend to lead with, or at least recently in the last 10 years or so, with the values conversation.
Right.
And that's going to be a way of turning off a lot of people very quickly. There's got to be a way to integrate values without wagging your finger.
Right.
And I think we used to be better at that, it seems to me. But if we go in there, if your approach to trade is to sort of start with the values, then there are a lot of other countries that will get in before you. But there's a way probably in which I think there used to be this idea that when Canadians would show up, Canadian businesses or Canadian aid workers or whatever, that they sort of walk with their values and they teach by walking with their values. And somehow we've got into the notion that the way that you express your values is to give people lectures. And I don't think that always works. But I think Africa is a growth market. It's tough. It's you don't have the infrastructure, transportation, telecommunications, but therein lies the opportunities. But you're also playing against much bigger players in China and increasingly the United States and in Europe that are prepared to spend a lot more money. So it's not going to be as easy as just walking through the door and sort of selling something. It's going to take a lot of work.
All right. Julie, I want to pick up on some of the comments about the diaspora here. But before I do that, I want to clarify, we've talked about some of the big names, China, India, the European Union. But for people who aren't familiar, you've named a few of the nations in the ASEAN, sort of the 10 nations here. But give us the full 10. Who are the countries?
Right. So ASEAN has 10 member states, and that would include Brunei, Cambodia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Laos, Indonesia, and the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. Yes.
All right.
So deserves an award for that.
That was good. That was good for Joe out there. Now, we know as Canada's population quite diverse, how could the diaspora help communities and governments sort of initiate the trade with the respective home countries?
Right. I think this is a very important point. There are about 1.5 million Southeast Asian Canadians, and we can tap into their expertise, their language and skills, and their knowledge of these ASEAN markets, including students. And here I could also add international students who have a lot of knowledge about these markets. And this is very important because in order to, before we can start doing business, we have to build relationships. And those relationships can be facilitated by having access to knowledge of the region and through language and culture.
All right.
Yes.
Meredith, I'm curious, who is more responsible for sort of driving Canada's global trade policy? Is it the companies, the small, medium, large companies that we're talking about, or is it government?
Well, in my experience, it can be both. Companies will definitely come to government and seek help accessing markets. And so typically those tend to be large markets. So companies interested in the United States or it's interested in Europe and comes to government and has an interest there. But in parallel, you're also going to have government seeking to open access through either investment agreements or free trade agreements or other commercial types of contracts in order to advance foreign policy objectives. So it can be both, and they're not, sometimes they go together because it's not uncommon that as we build relations in terms of foreign policy with another country, we also then seek to tie that with trade, and there's commercial interest there as well. So I can think of examples with both, and a lot of the Trans-Pacific Partnership really, I think, was a shared interest of both business and government to advance that agreement. But then another example that I can think of that was very much foreign policy oriented was Canada's original agreement with Ukraine under Stephen Harper. And that was largely done for reasons of foreign policy. That was at the time that Russia had invaded the first time. And Prime Minister Harper had a very strong desire to demonstrate support for Ukraine, and so worked to advance that trade agreement. And a major rationale for that was around foreign policy.
All
so
right.
it can be both.
Okay. Mark, I'm curious, is there a possibility that we can squeeze more out of the Canadian-European Union Free Trade Agreement?
I think we can, but I think keeping in mind, as I said, the advantage of the United States is that it was a big market that right next door to us, and Europe isn't. They call it a single market, but it's really not a single market. So so you're trying to access a lot of little markets that speak different languages, and Europe has been swallowing its Eastern European flank and integrating that into what's the single market, and pretty soon it'll be perhaps integrating Ukraine, a massive country in terms of population with other demands. And so you start thinking, where would we actually sell to, again, apart from niche areas and services? It's kind of hard to see. There's got to be more that we can do. But the problem, one of the things with the European Union is they do have a lot of regulations, and they're not going to alter their regulations just for Canada, as we've seen in some of the agricultural products. So notionally we have achieved some sort of market access, but then I think what some of our producers find out is when they want to sell it back into there, we're using processes that we use to sell in the North American landscape, and we'd have to change our whole production methods to get into Europe. So we haven't figured that part out yet. So there's probably opportunities. It'll never replace the United States, and that's sometimes the problem I have with the way we talk about these third options and other options, is that we are sitting on top the best next option to us, which is to figure out how do we look south and figure out the changes that are happening in the United States to make ourselves relevant to the United States again. And, the Canadian-American relationship has changed many, many times over 100 years. But the key thing is we've always at the right moments found our way to make ourselves useful. I guess the question I have is have we matured enough as a country that we now think we don't have to make ourselves useful? And if that's the case, we're going to have a problem, I think. But if we can figure out with new leadership from whatever political party to sort of say, yes, we understand that the bargain is changing in the United States, I think there's going to be more bang for the buck pursuing that than there will be pretty much anywhere else in the world.
All right. I'm going to pick up on that just after I ask Julie this question. But Julie, if the U.S. tariffs imposed on Canada are minimal and don't last very long, what should Canada's next steps regarding the Indo-Pacific trade be in that case, assuming that the ASEAN Pact is concluded?
Right. I think that regardless of our relations with the U.S., I think there is always a business case for Canadian companies to do business with the Indo-Pacific, which is a vast market there. And if I could just speak in terms of ASEAN. Currently, our trade with ASEAN is about $40 billion, but there's a lot more potential for that. And then the government of Canada has done the groundwork for that. So we have embassies in all 10 ASEAN countries. We have an agricultural office in the Philippines. We have Export Development Canada offices in Indonesia and Vietnam, and we have an Indo-Pacific trade representative based in Indonesia. So I really think that now is the good time and the best time to invest in these relationships in the Indo-Pacific markets.
All right, we have about less than 2 minutes. I have one question for all of you. I'm going to start with Julie. I'm going to work my way down. If you were a trade advisor to the new government, whichever party wins, what would be your word of wisdom about Canada's trading future?
I would say building trust with reliable trade partners and use our free trade agreements to take advantage and to educate Canadian companies how to take advantage of these trade agreements.
All right, Mark?
I think I would counsel pragmatism, and as opposed to nationalism, I'm going to say. I think don't back ourselves into a corner. Look for every opportunities that are there, and just try to be pragmatic about it. I realize the world is changing, and see where we can find opportunities. And that's, some of them might be in our own backyard.
All right. Meredith, you get the last word.
The United States market is unlikely to ever be replaced. And so we have to find ways to continue to trade with the Americans. At the same time, I believe strongly that we should always be seeking to diversify trade, even when times are good with the Americans. When times are bad, it's not the time to light off all the alarms and say, it's time to diversify trade. We need to be doing this even when times are good, if for no other reason that being less dependent on the Americans actually increases our leverage with the Americans. So, on that last point, being less dependent on the Americans means that we need to find more ways to get our goods to market, not going through the United States. And that will actually increase our leverage with the Americans, and that can only be good for us in the long term.
All right, we are going to leave it there. Meredith, Mark, Julie, thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight. Really insightful stuff. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Casual fans may think that baseball in Ontario began with the arrival of Major League Baseball's Blue Jays in 1977. Not so, not by a long shot. The first organized baseball in this province was played in the 18th century. And rather than being something imported from the United States, author William Humber says the game had its own birth and growth independent from whatever Abner Doubleday came up with in Cooperstown, New York. It's all chronicled in Bill's new book, Old Ontario at Bat, Baseball's Unheralded Ancestry. And we're delighted that it brings William Humber back to this studio. Let's just hit this premise right off the top, shall we?
Yeah.
The conventional wisdom has always been that baseball started in New York State and somehow got imported to the province of Ontario and Canada in the mid-19th century. True or false?
False. Even Stephen Harper, in his otherwise really good book about hockey, referred to baseball as the American importation, but not true, Stephen. And he wasn't the first. Many have said that over the years. It developed as a folk game in Ontario the same way it did in the United States, and went through the modernization process probably around the time of the 1820s, 30s, until we know the game as it is today became really kind of popular in the press in the mid-1850s, and from then on takes off as the game as we know it today.
We do love our myths, though, because
Yes.
the myth of baseball being imported up here, and the myth of baseball being started by Abner Doubleday in Cooperstown, New York, which I gather also is not true.
Oh, fraudulent. Totally fraudulent.
Totally fraudulent.
Totally fraudulent, yeah. Made up by Albert Spalding, who was hoping to prove that baseball had an American origin, not, as in fact was the case, an English origin. The word baseball actually appears in English works in the 18th century, as you well mentioned. Not only did George III, the fellow against whom Americans rose up in rebellion, play the game with his father, but so did his father, the then Prince of Wales, who died in 1851. So lots of accounts of them playing what was essentially a folk game, a game that you would, make up on a playground just for fun.
Okay, I mean, I've got to ask this, because a lot of what you talk about in this book is going back a long way.
Yes, it is.
So you've got the earliest account of baseball in Ontario being played in 1792.
Yes.
And I guess the question is, how do you know?
Well, it's a dubious account, but nevertheless, the account in 1860 said that the Duke of Kent was visiting Upper Canada, Niagara, in 1792, just after Upper Canada become Upper Canada, having split from Quebec, as it turned out, and was given a game of baseball to watch by Joseph Brant and his people. We're kind of uncertain whether it's legit or not, but look, the account in 1860 said baseball. And there is an account of a game in New Brunswick a year after that. So we know the game in its popular form was being played. And certainly our early accounts from 1803 would validate that, baseball was here at that time.
But some of the games that you've described there, I mean, the scores were 45 to 13 or 30 to 25.
Yeah.
You don't see those kinds of scores today. So do we assume that it was a very different kind of game?
It was. And even the New York game, which became, in effect, the popular game of baseball by the mid-1850s, you could say, what it did was it did away with what was called plugging. And plugging meant that a runner between bases, if you threw the ball at him and it connected, he was out. Well, that meant you had to use a very soft ball, for obvious reasons. The New York game allowed a much harder ball to be introduced into the game. And that essentially became the game as we know it today. But pitchers were told that they were much closer to the plate. They had to throw underhand. They had to throw where the batter wanted the ball thrown, high or low. Fielders did not have gloves. So it's amazing the scores were as low as they were, if you think about it.
Okay. Sheldon, you want to bring this graphic up? And there, right at the very top, is the word baseball, but it's not one word, it's two words.
Yes.
Was that baseball different from baseball?
No. It was just the way they spelled it in those days. Football was the same. It was a two-worded game. And in fact, the earliest spelling of baseball wasn't even base, B-A-S-E. It was B-A-S-S. It was an English spelling. It was essentially the game as we think of it today. It was a game with a ball. It was a game with bases that you ran between. Whether they used a bat or not, or what kind of club they used, will probably never be certain, because it wasn't a big game. It wasn't an official game. It wasn't anything that people took seriously in those days. It was just for fun.
Was it more like cricket?
It stole one thing from cricket, and that was the earliest games in Ontario, certainly those played in 1819 and 1838 that we know about in Hamilton and in Beachville. It had a 360-degree playing surface. So you could literally hit the ball anywhere you wanted. And truly the revolutionary character of the New York game was that they reduced the ground's effect to a 90-degree game, such as we know today. I've often told people I was at an international cricket match in London at Lord's Cricket Ground watching a game of cricket, and I was amazed at how far from the field I was, because it's a 360-degree game.
Okay. Anybody who follows basketball knows that a Canadian invented basketball.
Of course.
James Naismith.
Yes.
Who's the James Naismith of Ontario baseball?
Well, the guy I give the most credit to is William Shuttleworth. But in saying that, I would say he did not invent it. The game was already here, had been played for a long time, was already a popular game, but certainly made the game popular in Hamilton.
That's a picture of him right there. Which one is him?
He's the one on the left, the shorter man.
The shorter man,
Yeah.
and with the baseball bat in his hand.
Yes.
And is he wearing a bow tie, or what's he wearing?
Well, those were the costumes that they put on in those days. They were still kind of trying to invent the baseball costume, as it
Okay.
were.
And what did he do in Hamilton, Ontario in 1854 that was so important?
He started a formal team. Up until then, the game had been informal. It was played sporadically. In fact, it was played on Militia Muster Day on the 4th of June, at least on 2 accounts, way before 1854. But he kind of institutionalized it. He made it possible. Newspapers started reporting the game. He took the game on tour. He played in one of the first international, in fact, the first international baseball game ever played, and Americans are baffled by this. It wasn't played in the United States. It was played in what we now know as Niagara Falls, Canada, which was then known as Clifton. And poor Americans could never find where Clifton was on the map. And all they had to do was, look at across the river back in 1860 when a team from Buffalo and a team from Hamilton played that first game.
William Shuttleworth,
Yes.
is there anything anywhere in Canada, a plaque, a statue, a something to acknowledge his contribution to this game?
Well, no, not that I'm aware of, and nor is there a plaque to honor that first international baseball game ever played. And intriguingly, the first ever international hockey game was played in the United States, in Burlington, Vermont. So, our national game as we know it today gets credit in the States. Their national game, as they like to call it, was played first internationally in Canada.
So the first formal baseball clubs were formed in the 1850s in
Correct.
what cities in Ontario?
Well, the big city at first was Hamilton, but it was soon surpassed by Woodstock. And Woodstock reigned throughout pretty well all the 1860s, except for 10 days when Little Ingersoll, their rivals, in many respects, won the championship, which of course they in those days called the Championship of Canada, when in fact no team, basically east of Kingston ever played in any of these championship games, and unwisely let Woodstock back into the tournament, as it were, to challenge them again. But Guelph really took off with the championship in the 1870s to be surpassed by London eventually in about 1876.
No disrespect to these cities or towns, but you have not mentioned the biggest cities in the province yet. Did they not have teams?
Well, the Hamilton Spectator, of all papers, noted in 1881, finally the Globe and Mail is writing, the Globe as it's then known,
Right.
is writing about baseball. And as a historian, you're always frustrated when you look at the Globe and there's so little about baseball. It appears that Toronto was more enamored with cricket. They had a great cricket ground, Care Hall, it was called, and it was only by the 1880s that they got into the game. Had they got into the game earlier, it's more than likely the National League would have come calling. Baseball would have probably been a professional game in the big city, because they wanted big cities in the league, the National League did. And who knows how Canadian sports history would have changed.
Because the National League started in the
76.
76, okay.
Yeah.
And you think there was the possibility that Toronto could have had a National League, Major League Baseball team then?
Albert Spalding was a huge promoter of Toronto, said he couldn't understand why the city didn't have it. There was a fellow, Lemuel Felcher, I believe his name was, who talked about putting a team in the National League around 1885 and said, I don't think we're ready for it yet. Well, it turned out if we weren't ready then, we're going to have to wait a heck of a long time. A year later, he was arrested for felonious activity that got him thrown in prison. So maybe it was a good thing they didn't.
We waited another 100 years for Major League Baseball to
Exactly.
come here.
Yes, we did.
Not to Montreal, but to Toronto.
Right.
Now, okay, so there's a team in Hamilton in 1861 called the Hamilton Maple Leafs.
Yes.
Is there any connection between that team and the eventual Toronto Maple Leaf baseball team, which played at the foot of Bathurst Street and which actually
Yes.
still exists in inter-county baseball?
Absolutely. The name still exists, obviously. The Maple Leaf name was first used by that Hamilton team because the original name of the Hamilton team were the Young Canadians. And Woodstock took on that name, and Hamilton thought, we don't want to be, confused with them, so we're going to call ourselves the Maple Leafs. Toronto did have a Maple Leaf team. It was a cricket team. So that preceded, the Toronto Maple Leafs as baseball team far preceded, of course, the Toronto Maple Leafs hockey team, which, as we well know, were known as the St. Patrick's before they were the Maple Leafs. So, Toronto and our sports history is kind of full of these little oddities, you might say.
Was the baseball they were playing then professional or amateur?
It was probably best thought of as semi-professional. In other words, Woodstock had the best team and were bringing in, and so were Guelph, they were bringing in American professionals by the 1870s. But they were pretending to be amateur. Well, no American professional is going to come to Canada to play baseball and do it for free for the honor of Guelph or Woodstock. So they would be given a sinister, some form of, local job, local payment under the table, and so they could always pretend to be amateur. But fully professional teams in Ontario are here by 1876 in Guelph and London.
And what kind of crowds would show up to watch them play?
Well, the big audience, they would say, would be 8,000 to 10,000 people. Further study has probably revealed that maybe it was half that, but 4,000 or 5,000 people is still a pretty decent sized crowd. And when London won the International Association Championship, which I argue is was a significant major league rival to the National League, they were drawing crowds of up to 4,000 or 5,000 people in their early days.
You referenced earlier in our conversation June the 4th as being a big date and a big deal. How come?
Well, it was Militia Muster Day, and it was put in place by Sir Guy Carleton, and he did it largely to ensure that the repetition of the War of 1812 would at least find Canadian men ready to take up arms. So it was a training day, ostensibly. They didn't have much equipment, and so they would march around for a couple of hours on the 4th of June and celebrate King George III's birthday, I might add.
Same day.
Yes, same day.
June the 4th.
Absolutely. They would march around, and then basically it's an excuse to get drunk in the afternoon, and they play baseball. And we have at least 2 accounts of old-fashioned baseball being played on that day. 1819 in Hamilton, as I say, and 1838 in Beachville.
At some point, American professionals are recruited to come to Canada to play.
Yes.
How accepted or controversial was that?
As long as they pretended that they were amateurs, nobody seemed to worry about it. It was enough to simply say that they were defending the honor of Ingersoll or Guelph or Woodstock. And as long as the town's, was winning games and was happy with that, the first guy we have is a guy named Sam Jackson, who had played for the Boston Red Stockings, not the Boston Red Sox of today. They are essentially the Atlanta Braves of today, if one follows the journey, as it were. And he had to pretend that he was running a business in Guelph when he came to town, but everybody knew he was there for the money.
There was a guy named George Sleeman who played baseball. The beer guy?
Yes.
Same family?
Yes, the guy. He is the guy.
He's the guy who started Sleeman Brewery.
He started the brewery and was a great promoter of baseball in Guelph, took the team to the big tournament in Watertown, New York, where they won a championship in 1874. They defeated, amongst other teams, Guelph did, the Ku Klux Klan Club of Oneida, New York. I mean, hard to believe these teams could exist. And he flourished for a couple of years as the director, as it were, of the owner, for want of a better term, of the Guelph Maple Leafs. Unfortunately, the Prohibition movement put them out of the beer business, and it's only been in the last 40 years that they've come back, as it were. But under the Sleeman name and, still within, at least at the time when they came back, they were still within the Sleeman family. I believe they've been sold to out-of-country interests since then.
Let's look beyond the kind of men's semi-professional baseball that you write about in this book. And to that end, we've had Heidi L.M. Jacobs in that chair.
Yes.
Because we did a show with her on the book that she wrote about the Chatham Colored All-Stars.
Yep.
So black baseball is finally getting its due in terms of the history books. But what about women's baseball or indigenous baseball? How widespread was that at the time?
Well, I have 2 accounts in the book. One of a team being formed in Guelph in 1872, a women's team. And 2 years later, at a place called Dutton near Lake Erie, they were forming a baseball team, a women's baseball team. There was a team from the Tuscaroras, from the Six Nations, who played in a baseball tournament in the mid-1870s. So the game was already, in effect, percolating throughout the entire province. Everybody wanted to play baseball of all ages. The first all-black team we know about in Ontario was 1869.
Wow.
Many years, before even the Chatham All-Stars. And they were known as the Lincoln Nine, in honor, obviously, of Abraham Lincoln. They played out of London, Ontario.
But how much, for example, if there was an indigenous team, would they have played a so-called white team or a black team?
They did in the tournament. The intriguing thing is that the 1869 black tournament, they were not invited, shall we say, to perform in the mainstream tournament that was being held, whereas the the indigenous team, the Tuscaroras, did play and finished third in this tournament that was held. You know.
Okay, I want to quote John Thorne, who is,
Yes.
of course, one of the great baseball historians, and he says, we should not confuse the absence of evidence for the evidence of absence.
It's a great little quote.
It is a great line. So, having said that, what kind of original source material could you get your hands on to write this book?
Well, one of them was the diary of Eli Plater from 1803, talking about playing ball in what was then New York, Toronto. A lot of the accounts, of course, are long after the fact, which is always a frustration with researchers. So you have to try and compare what they were talking about long after the fact with what, in fact, we know about the time. So the 1838 diagram, for instance, that Adam Ford did of a Beachville diagram, in fact, was replicated not quite the same way in a book in 1914 called Baldum in the U.S. And there's enough similarities between them that we can say that one kind of validates and verifies the other. But a lot of times with research, you have to kind of work backwards from what we do know to what, in fact, we've been able to find out since then in remembrances in other accounts that have come to us.
Why are you so interested in a period of time and a game that you obviously could never have seen and never experienced?
Well, I often say I never saw games in the 1920s, and that was a baseball interest too. You know what? It was largely because when I would go to 19th century baseball conferences with my American friends, they had an inability to cross the border. And it was like those old weather maps that you sometimes saw in USA Today, where the weather would hit Detroit, disappear in Ontario, and then reappear on the American side of the border. And to me, there was just as much material north of the border as there was south. It's not a Canadian separate from the United States. It's kind of integrated. We're sharing ideas. We're going back and forth. It's how other games develop, like football, basketball, etc. It was a sharing across the border, and we were always until at least 1880 controlling the game ourselves. It was our game. The New York papers would refer to it as the Canadian game. There was no question that we wanted to see the game. As we have done with football, we've retained that kind of separate distinction from the United States throughout our entire history. In baseball, that began to fade by the 1880s, and we really became integrated into the American, the larger North American system of baseball.
Any theories as to why we seem to be very adamant about making sure we get our hockey history right? We still, of course, have a distinctive football game up here that is different from the Americans, but baseball, we've kind of allowed that to lag. Why is that?
I think it's because baseball has largely a north-south flow. In other words, people in New England tend to be Boston Red Sox fans. It's a natural thing. People on the West Coast tend to, gravitate to Pacific Coast teams. And in fact, the first baseball in Victoria and Vancouver we're aware of, they weren't playing across Canada. They were playing down the coast in San Francisco and Los Angeles and places like that. And I think that's been the history. Our first national team, the first time we ever put a national baseball team together, given its long history in Canada, wasn't until 1967 at the Pan American Games in Winnipeg.
My last question for you is admittedly a bit of a speculative one. So here we go. What do you think the people who played this game 100 and 200 years ago would make of what's happening today, namely players from all over the world playing in dome stadiums, playing in some cases on artificial grass, played by men, some of whom make $1 billion Canadian dollars to play this game?
Well, on the one hand, they'd be astounded. But I think more deeply, they would be surprised at how similar in many respects and the feeling of the excitement associated with the game was to the games that they were playing. The rules were very different. The uniforms were different. Many cases, they didn't have gloves. But in its essence, it was baseball as kind of we experience it today and have that feeling. So when I go to the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame in St. Mary's, we honor that 200 years or more of history, and they're the people that are distributing the book. And I said, good for them. They recognize that history, and I'm thrilled to be able to tell that story in a more fulsome way.
You ever met Stephen Harper?
I have briefly met him when he came to Bowmanville, where I live, to start a hockey museum that we had in Bowmanville.
And
it was very brief.
Did you have an argument with him?
I did not. No.
You did not?
I think it was pre his hockey book. So in fairness to him, he made the comment, And he was not alone. The Canadian Forum said, when we bow down to Babe Ruth, we're showing we're part of the American empire. That was in the 1920s, so we've had this kind of prevailing attitude for a long, long time in Canada, and it's about time we got over it. That's my feeling.
If I see him again, I'll give him a copy of your book.
Excellent.
Old Ontario at Bat, baseball's unheralded ancestry, and we are delighted that it has brought William Humber to our studio today. Bill, thanks so much. Great to see you again.
Great to be here, and it's available through the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame in St. Mary's, Ontario.
Excellent.
Donald Trump keeps issuing executive orders. Do we have those? Can our prime minister give orders like the US president? Not exactly, and the difference says a lot about our two forms of government. Let's get into it. When the American presidency changes hands, there's usually a flurry of action during the transition. A retiring president may try to rush through last-minute changes, while the incoming president may have some day-one priorities. The president gets his powers from Article 2 of the US Constitution. This is a key difference. A US president has certain executive powers inherent to the office. A Canadian prime minister doesn't exercise power in the same way. Executive powers of our government are vested in the Crown, not the Prime Minister. Where the Americans have executive orders, we have orders in council. The Crown gives orders in council with cabinet. But the power of the Crown is mostly ceremonial. It's only exercised on the advice of the Prime Minister or Premier and cabinet. It would take an extreme situation for a governor general or a lieutenant governor to ignore the advice of their first minister. But the power does exist. In fact, 5 premiers have been dismissed by their lieutenant governors. Orders in council can be a government exercising powers that are given to it by law, such as the power to appoint people to government positions. You know Metrolinx? Its board of directors is appointed by orders in council. An order in council can also exercise one of the Crown's inherent powers or privileges, called Crown prerogatives. For example, the ability to dissolve and convene Parliament is a Crown prerogative. When Doug Ford asked the Lieutenant Governor to call an election, that was done through an order in council. But these orders are just the tip of the iceberg. Can Trump-style executive decisions happen in Canada? Here, the biggest difference between Canada and the US is the importance of cabinet. Americans have a cabinet, so do Canadian governments. But in the US, appointees are not elected members of the government. In Canada, cabinet is made up of elected politicians. That's what makes the difference. Cabinet collectively makes essentially every major government decision. Cabinet ministers are responsible to the Prime Minister for sure, but they're also responsible to voters in their riding. Cabinet can, if it chooses, even oust a Prime Minister. This can have a moderating effect. A majority government with a doormat cabinet can still do basically whatever it wants. As the saying goes, elections have consequences. But without specific prime ministerial powers and with a powerful cabinet made up of elected politicians, a rogue prime minister or premier is easier to keep in check.
That is the agenda for Thursday, March 27th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, John Michael McGrath will be joined by the Trillium's Jessica Smith-Cross to discuss the launch of the federal election. You won't want to miss that. I'm Jan Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.